I always knew my sister was spoiled, but I never imagined she'd steal my identity to buy a mansion. When the bank called about $1 million debt, I didn't scream. I quietly filed a police report, drove to her housewarming party, and served her the papers in front of everyone. Before we continue today's story, we have an urgent announcement to make. Due to technical issues, we are pivoting towards another channel. Please subscribe to our new channel, Inherited Revenge. You can find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag on this video. Make sure to switch over now so you don't miss out. Thank you for your support. Now back to the story. The call came on a Tuesday evening, the kind of gray, drizzling Tuesday that feels like it has lasted for 48 hours instead of 12. I had just walked through the door of my apartment, my feet throbbing in the way only a senior clinical pharmacist's feet can throb after a 10-hour shift on concrete floors. My scrub smelled faintly of antiseptic and the stale coffee I'd been nursing since dawn. I dropped my bag on the entryway table, the keys landing with a heavy clatter that echoed in the silence of my living room. I lived alone, a choice I had made deliberately. I liked the quiet. I liked the order. My apartment wasn't large, but it was mine, paid for with rent checks written on the first of the month every month for the last 6 years. I was safe here, or at least I thought I was. I was halfway to the kitchen, dreaming of a glass of water and 10 minutes of silence, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost ignored it. The screen displayed a toll-free number I didn't recognize, the kind usually attached to telemarketers or political surveys. But something in my gut, a small, cold prickle of instinct honed by years of double-checking prescription dosages, made me stop. I slid my thumb across the screen. "Hello, this is Alina." "Good evening, Ms. Alina Vance," a man's voice said. It was professional, crisp, but laced with that specific tone of urgency that debt collectors use. "I'm calling from the Fraud and Risk Management Department at First National Trust regarding your mortgage." I blinked, my hand freezing on the handle of the refrigerator. "I'm sorry, you have the wrong person. I don't have a mortgage with First National. I rent my apartment." There was a pause on the other end, the sound of typing clicking furiously in the background. "This is regarding the property at 4200 Oakwood Drive. Our records show a primary mortgage in your name, Ms. Vance. We're calling because the first payment was due yesterday, and the direct debit you set up has been returned for insufficient funds." I laughed. It was a dry, bewildered sound that scraped against my throat. "Sir, I think you're confused. I have never heard of Oakwood Drive. I have never applied for a mortgage. I bank with a credit union. You definitely have the wrong Alina Vance." "Ms. Vance," the voice dropped an octave, losing its customer service sheen and becoming deadly serious. "I need you to verify the last 4 digits of your social security number for me." "I am not giving you my information," I snapped, my exhaustion morphing into irritation. "This is obviously a scam. If you don't verify, I cannot help you, but the account is currently flagged for a missed payment of $4,800, he said calmly. "And the full loan amount is $850,000. The room seemed to tilt. The number hit me like a physical blow to the chest. $850,000. "Read them to me," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Read me the last 4 digits you have on file." He did. He read 4 numbers, my 4 numbers. The phone slipped slightly in my sweaty palm. I grabbed the counter for support, my knuckles turning white. That is my social, but I didn't sign anything. I didn't buy a house. I've been at work all day. I've been at work for 10 years. "The loan originated 45 days ago, Ms. Vance. The closing documents were signed in person. We have a notarized signature." "That's impossible," I breathed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Who is the co-borrower?" "There is no co-borrower, ma'am. You are the sole proprietor on the deed." I slid down the front of the refrigerator until I hit the floor, the cold tile seeping through my scrubs. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation, a computer glitch, a clerical error. but deep down, beneath the panic, a sickening realization was already taking root. I knew who wanted a house like that. I knew who had been talking about dream homes for months. The address, I managed to choke out. Say the address again. 4200 Oakwood Drive. I didn't need to write it down. I knew that street. It was the exclusive new development on the north side of town. The one my sister, Chloe, had driven me since just 3 weeks ago, pointing at a massive colonial-style house with a wraparound porch. "I'm moving in next month," she had squealed, clutching my arm. "Mark made it happen, Alina. He finally made it happen." I closed my eyes, and the darkness behind my eyelids swirled with red. The nausea was immediate and overwhelming. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a hacker in a basement halfway across the world. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis of a terminal illness. It was a rot that had come from inside my own bloodline. The next hour was a blur of bureaucratic nightmare. I stayed on the phone with the fraud agent. His name was David, and he was surprisingly gentle once he realized I was hyperventilating for 45 minutes. I had to answer security questions that only I should know: the make of my first car, the street I grew up on, the name of my elementary school. "Okay, Ms. Vance," David said, his voice sounding tinny through the speaker. "I've flagged the account as disputed, but because the documents appear legal and notarized, this isn't going to be a simple fix. You need to file a police report immediately. Tonight, we need a case number to pause the collections process." "I understand," I said, my voice sounding hollow, like it was coming from someone else standing across the room. "And Ms. Vance," David added, hesitating slightly, "if you know who might have done this, you need to be prepared. Identity theft of this magnitude usually involves someone with access to your physical documents." I hung up and sat in the dark kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the apartment. I felt cold, a deep, shivering cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. I pulled up the map on my phone and typed in 4200 Oakwood Drive. There it was, a Zillow listing marked sold. The photos were professional, glossy: hardwood floors, a chef's kitchen with a marble island, a master bath that looked like a spa. It was beautiful. It was extravagant. It was exactly the kind of house Chloe felt she deserved. I remembered the dinner at my parents' house 2 weeks ago. Chloe had been glowing, practically vibrating with excitement. She was wearing a new dress, something silk and expensive looking, and Mark, her husband, had been pouring expensive wine that he insisted he'd gotten from a private client. "It's a miracle, really," Chloe had said, waving her glass around, narrowly missing my mother's favorite vase. "Mark just worked his magic. We didn't think we'd qualify for the jumbo loan, but then suddenly, boom, approved. We got the keys on Monday." "I'm so proud of you both," my mother, Susan, had gushed, clapping her hands together. "You've worked so hard for this." I had sat there, eating my roast chicken, feeling a twinge of envy, but mostly relief. Chloe had been struggling financially for years, or rather, struggling to maintain a lifestyle she couldn't afford. I was just glad she wouldn't be asking me for rent money again. "It's all about leverage," Mark had said, winking at me from across the table. "Right, Alina, you have to know how to use your assets." I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Mark was always saying vague, pseudo-business nonsense like that. He worked in mortgage brokering, a job he described as helping people realize their dreams, but which mostly seemed to involve him wearing shiny suits and talking loudly on his Bluetooth earpiece. Now, sitting on my kitchen floor, that wink felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Leverage. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked to the small filing cabinet in my bedroom closet. I kept everything there: tax returns, birth certificate, passport. I was meticulous. I was the responsible one. I unlocked the drawer. Everything looked normal. My folders were color-coded and labeled. But as I flipped through the personal identity folder, I noticed something subtle. The edges of my social security card were slightly misaligned in the plastic sleeve, and the photocopy of my driver's license, the one I kept for emergencies, was on top of my birth certificate, not behind it where I always filed it. Someone had been here. I cast my mind back. When could they have gotten in? 3 months ago. The weekend I went to the pharmaceutical conference in Chicago. I had asked my mother to come over and feed my cat, Whiskers, but Mom had come down with the flu the day I left. "Don't worry, sweetie," Mom had texted me. "Chloe said she'd swing by and take care of Whiskers. She has a key, right?" I had hesitated then. Chloe was irresponsible. She'd probably forget to scoop the litter box, but I had no other choice. "Yes," I had replied. "Please remind her to lock the deadbolt." I stared at the file in my hand. Chloe had been in my apartment alone for 3 days. The anger didn't come as a hot flash. It came as a cold, calculating clarify. They had used my credit, my hard work, my perfect 800 score, to buy their fantasy L. Ife, they thought I was just the quiet, boring sister who would never notice, or maybe they thought that even if I did, I'd be too afraid of upsetting our parents to do anything about it. They counted on my passivity. They counted on my love for the family. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. I am a pharmacist. I deal in precision. I deal in toxicity. And I know exactly what happens when you introduce a poison into a system. You have to cut it out before it kills the host. To understand why this betrayal shattered me, you have to understand the dynamic of the Vance family. I was the eldest, the draft horse, the steady hand. Chloe was the show pony. She was 6 years younger than me, beautiful, charismatic, and utterly incapable of delayed gratification. Growing up, the narrative was always set. "Elena is so independent," my father Robert would say. "She doesn't need us. But Chloe is sensitive. She needs a little extra help." That little extra help had cost me a fortune over the years. When I graduated pharmacy school, buried in 6 figures of student loan debt, I lived on ramen and store-brand cereal for 3 years to pay it down aggressively. When Chloe dropped out of her second college because the vibes were off, my parents paid off her lease on her luxury apartment. When I started my first job, I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a broken air conditioner. When Chloe turned 25, she totaled her car because she was texting, and my parents couldn't afford to replace it. Who stepped in? I did. I gave her $3,000 for a down payment on a sensible sedan. She used it to lease a BMW she couldn't afford to insure. "She's your sister," my mother would say, guilt-tripping me whenever I tried to set a boundary. "Family helps family, we don't keep score." I had internalized that mantra. I had swallowed my resentment for decades. I convinced myself that being the good daughter meant setting myself on fire to keep Chloe warm. Then came Mark. If Chloe was a chaotic storm, Mark was the weatherman who convinced you it was sunny while you were drowning. He appeared 3 years ago, sweeping Chloe off her feet with grand gestures that I suspected were put on credit cards. He claimed to be a high-volume mortgage specialist. From the moment I met him, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. He was too polished. His teeth were too white, his handshake too firm, his compliments too generic. He treated every family gathering like a networking event. "Elena, babe," he'd say, cornering me at Thanksgiving, swirling a glass of scotch he'd poured from my father's special stash without asking. "Pharmacists make bank, right? What are you pulling in these days? 150K? More." "I do all right, Mark," I'd say, inching away. "You investing that?" He'd press, his eyes scanning me not with attraction, but with appraisal like I was a property he was valuing. "You let it sit in a savings account, you're losing money to inflation. You need to leverage your equity. I could set you up with some investment properties. Passive income, baby. That's the dream." "I like my savings account," I'd reply curtly. He would laugh, a condescending bark. "Scared money don't make money, Elena. You play it too safe. You gotta take risks to live the high life." I realized now that he had been studying me. He wasn't just making small talk, he was prospecting. He saw my frugality not as a virtue, but as a resource he couldn't wait to tap. He saw my clean credit history not as the result of my discipline, but as a blank canvas for his masterpiece of fraud. He knew the systems. That was the most terrifying part. Mark knew exactly what the underwriters needed to see. He knew which documents could be photocopied and which needed a wet signature, and how to forge the latter. He knew that if he kept the payments current for a few months, the bank wouldn't look too closely at the initial application. He just hadn't planned on running out of cash so quickly, or maybe he just didn't care. I looked at the clock on the microwave. It was 9:45 p.m. The police station was open 24 hours. My mother's voice echoed in my head, "Family helps family." I grabbed my purse. I grabbed the file folder with my birth certificate and social security card. I grabbed my car keys. "Family helps family," I said aloud to the empty apartment. My voice was steady now, cold, and I'm going to help Chloe learn the most expensive lesson of her life. I walked out the door and locked it behind me. The fluorescent lights of the 12th precinct hummed with a low, headache-inducing buzz that seemed to vibrate right through my skull. It was nearly midnight. I sat on a hard plastic chair that was bolted to the floor, clutching my file folder like a shield. Across from me, Officer Miller, a man with tired eyes and a formidable mustache, was typing slowly on a keyboard that looked like it had survived the 90s. "So let me get this straight, Ms. Vance," he said, pausing to take a sip from a styrofoam cup. "You're saying you have no knowledge of this property purchase? You weren't present at the closing." "No," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I was at a pharmaceutical conference in Chicago on the date the documents were allegedly signed. I have my flight records, my hotel receipt, and a time-stamped badge log from the convention center." He raised an eyebrow, finally looking up from the screen. "That's good. That's very good. Usually these cases are a he said, she said mess, but physical impossibility, that gives us teeth. I want to file a formal report for identity theft and mortgage fraud," I said clearly, "and I need an identity theft affidavit." "We can do that," Miller said. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "But you need to be aware of what this starts. Once I file this, it's a criminal investigation. If this traces back to a family member, which in 90% of these cases it does, the DA picks it up. You can't just drop charges later because your mom calls crying. This is a felony. We're talking federal prison time for wire fraud." I looked at the scuffed linoleum floor. I thought about Mark's smirk. I thought about Chloe's laugh as she drove that BMW I helped her get. I thought about the sheer entitlement required to steal nearly $1 million of my creditworthiness because they felt they deserved a castle they hadn't earned. "I understand," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "File it." The next morning, I didn't go to work. I called in sick, a first in 7 years, and drove straight to the glass-walled office of James Mercer. James and I had gone to high school together. He had been the quiet kid in the back of AP Calculus who always let me borrow his notes. Now, he was a forensic accountant who specialized in divorce and corporate embezzlement. I laid the police report and the printouts from the bank on his mahogany desk. "James," I said, skipping the pleasantries, "I need you to look at this. I need to know how they did it, and I need to know how deep the hole is." James adjusted his glasses, his expression shifting from welcoming to severe as he scanned the papers. He didn't speak for a long time, just flipping pages and making small humming noises. Finally, he stopped at the signature page of the mortgage deed. "This is sloppy," he muttered. "Look at the pen pressure, Alina. See these little dots at the start and end of the loops in your name." I leaned in. "Yes. That's hesitation marks. Someone didn't sign this, they drew it. They likely traced a signature you'd given them previously." He looked up at me. "Do you recognize the notary stamp?" I squinted at the seal. "Tanya R. Lewis, commission expires 2028. "No," I said, "I've never met a Tanya." James swiveled his chair to his computer and began typing furiously. "Let's see. Tanya Lewis, Public Records. Here we go. Associated with Prestige Title Services." And who owns Prestige Title Services? He clicked a few more times. Ah, a shell company registered to an LLC in Delaware. He spun the screen around. But look at the registered agent address for the LLC. My stomach dropped. It was a P.O. box in a strip mall 3 blocks from Mark's old office. Mark, I whispered. Mark implies intent, James corrected. Mark implies conspiracy. He didn't just stumble into this. He set up a fake notary or paid one off to validate a forged signature. This isn't just fraud, Alina. This is racketeering. But here is the scarier part. He pulled up my credit report on a second monitor. It was a sea of red flags I hadn't seen because I had frozen my credit after the call, not before. They didn't just buy the house, James said softly. 3 days after closing, an application was submitted for a home equity line of credit, a HELOC against the property, for $200,000. They're trying to cash out the equity, I asked, horrified. They're trying to strip the asset, James said. They used your credit to buy the house, and now they are using the house to get cash. If that HELOC goes through, they walk away with $200,000 in cash, and you're left with $1 million in debt on a house that's now underwater. Can we stop it? The police report freezes everything, James said. But we need to be smart. If you tip your hand too early, Mark might destroy the evidence of the notary fraud. He might shred the physical files. You need to get him to admit to the existence of the loan in front of witnesses before he knows you've gone to the cops. I nodded slowly, a plan forming in my mind. I can do that. I know exactly when to do that. The invitation came via group text, complete with confetti emojis. Chloe, dinner at the new place tonight. Mom and Dad are bringing lasagna. Alina, you have to come see it. It's finally ready. 7 p.m., don't be late. Sparkles. I stared at the SC. Rien for a long time. The audacity was breathtaking. They were inviting me to dinner in a house legally owned by me, bought with my stolen identity, to celebrate their achievement. Okay, I typed back. I'll be there. I didn't dress up. I wore jeans and a simple sweater. I wanted to look small. I wanted to look like the Alina they thought they knew, the pushover, the quiet one, the observer. When I pulled up to 4200 Oakwood Drive, my breath caught in my throat. It was obscene. A sprawling, white brick monstrosity with pillars in the front and a fountain in the driveway. Mark's leased Mercedes was parked prominently in the center, and my parents' sensible sedan was off to the side. Chloe opened the door before I even knocked. She looked radiant, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my first car. Alina, she squealed, pulling me into a hug that smelled of expensive perfume and deception. Oh my God, can you believe it? Come in, come in. You have to take your shoes off, though. The floors are imported Italian marble. I took off my boots, feeling the cold, hard stone beneath my socks. It's impressive, Chloe. Isn't it? Mark appeared from the hallway, holding a glass of scotch. He looked flushed, triumphant. Welcome to the manor, Alina. Not bad for a couple of kids from the block, huh? Not bad, I echoed. The tour was agonizing. They showed me the theater room, the wine cellar, the master suite with the balcony. My parents were trailing behind us, oohing and awing, my mother occasionally touching a curtain or a vase with reverence. I'm just so proud, my dad said, clapping Mark on the back. You promised you'd take care of my girl, Mark, and you delivered. We sat down for dinner in a dining room that felt like a museum exhibit. The lasagna was good, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. I waited until Mark was pouring the second bottle of wine. So, I said, my voice cutting through the chatter about window treatments, I got a weird phone call yesterday. The silence that followed was fractional, but I saw Mark's hand jerk slightly as he set the bottle down. Chloe froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Oh, Mark said, his voice a little too loud. Who from? Telemarketers are getting aggressive these days. It was from First National Trust, I said, watching him closely. They said I missed a mortgage payment. Mark laughed, but it was a brittle, cracking sound. That's ridiculous. You rent, Alina, probably just a phishing scam. You didn't give them any info, did you? Actually, I said, leaning forward, they had my social security number, and they said the mortgage was for this address, 4200 Oakwood Drive. The air left the room. My mother looked between us, confused. What? That doesn't make sense. Mark and Chloe bought this house. That's what I told them, I said, locking eyes with my sister. Chloe looked terrified, her eyes darting to Mark for cues. Mark cleared his throat, adjusting his collar. The sweat was starting to bead on his forehead. Okay, look, Alina, it's a funny story, actually. There was a complication with my debt-to-income ratio because of the business expansion. The broker suggested we needed a guarantor with a strong W-2 history to get the prime rate. A guarantor, I asked, or a borrower? It's just a formality. Mark waved his hand dismissively. We put you down as a non-occupant co-borrower just to push the paperwork through. It doesn't affect you at all. I pay the mortgage. You just helped us get the keys. I meant to tell you, but we were going to refinance in 6 months and take your name off anyway. No harm, no foul. You used my social security number, I said, my voice rising. You forged my signature. We didn't forge it, Chloe piped up, her voice shrill. Mark just signed it for you because you were in Chicago. We knew you'd say yes. You're my sister. You'd want us to have this house. You stole my identity, I said. Don't use words like stole, Mark snapped, his facade of charm crumbling into aggression. You're being dramatic, Alina. You always do this. You try to make everything about you. Look around. We are living here. We are building a life. You're just a name on a piece of paper for a few months. Why are you trying to ruin a nice family dinner? My father looked at me, his brow furrowed. Alina, if it's just for a few months, and Mark is paying for it, is it really a big deal to make a scene now? I looked at my father, the man who had taught me to be honest, now asking me to be complicit in a felony to avoid an awkward conversation. It is a big deal, Dad, I said, standing up. Because the bank called me for non-payment. Mark isn't paying for it. It was one payment, Mark shouted, slamming his hand on the table. A bank error. I transferred the funds this morning. You're lying, I said calmly, and I'm not going to let you drag me down with you. I walked out. I didn't tell them about the police report. I didn't tell them about James. I just left them in the silence of their stolen house, knowing that the clock was ticking. The fallout was immediate. By the time I got back to my apartment, I had 14 missed calls from my mother and a wall of text messages from Chloe ranging from "I'm sorry" to "How could you be so selfish?" to "You're jealous because you're alone." I didn't answer. I spent the night organizing my files. The next morning, James called me. His voice was grim. Alina, I found something. I ran a background check on Mark in Florida. He lived there for 2 years before meeting Chloe, right? Yes, I said. He said he was in property development. He was in property management, James corrected. And he was indicted for embezzling HOA funds. He pleaded down to a misdemeanor and paid restitution to avoid jail time, but he's barred from holding a real estate license in Florida. That's why he's a mortgage consultant here, not a licensed broker. He's working under someone else's umbrella. Does that help us? It establishes a pattern, James said, but here is the kicker. I pulled the title history for the Oakwood house. The seller was a shell company. Mark didn't buy this house from a family. He bought it from a flipper entity that he has ties to. I think he inflated the appraisal. The house isn't worth $850,000. It's probably worth $600,000. He pocketed the difference from the loan. I felt sick. He didn't just buy a house. He used me to launder money. Exactly. If you accept this debt, if you sign a quitclaim, like they might ask you to, you are accepting liability for a loan that is $250,000 underwater instantly. You would be bankrupt, Alina. They wouldn't just ruin your credit, they would garnish your wages for the rest of your life. I needed to steel myself. I knew what was coming next. That afternoon, my parents came to my apartment. They looked aged, tired. My mother's eyes were red. Elena, my mother started, sitting on my sofa and wringing her hands. We talked to Mark. He explained everything. He's very sorry. He just wanted to give Chloe the life she deserves. He committed a felony, Mom, I said, standing by the window. He made a mistake, my father argued. He's young, he's ambitious. Look, he has a plan. He drafted this document. My father pulled a paper out of his pocket. It's a letter stating that he assumes all financial responsibility. He says if you just sign this and, what did he call it? A forbearance request? He can fix the missed payment and refinance in 6 months. I took the paper. It was garbage, legally meaningless. It was a napkin promise against a federal banking contract. And if I don't, I asked. Elena, my mother cried, if you report this, Mark says he could go to jail. Chloe would lose her husband. She thinks she might be pregnant, Elena. You can't send your niece or nephew's father to prison. The manipulation was so heavy it felt like gravity increasing in the room. They were weaponizing a hypothetical baby to protect a criminal. He isn't paying the mortgage, Dad, I said softly. Even if I did nothing, the house would be foreclosed on in 3 months, and I would be on the hook for the balance. Do you have $200,000 to give me when the bank sues me? My father looked down. We don't have that kind of money. Then you're asking me to destroy my life, I said. You're asking me to sacrifice my career, my savings, and my future to protect Mark's lie. We're asking you to have mercy on your sister, my mother sobbed. I am having mercy, I said, my voice hardening. I'm stopping him before he steals everything you have, too. I ushered them out. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. My mother looked at me like I was a stranger. When the door clicked shut, I leaned against it and slid to the floor. I cried for 10 minutes. Then I wiped my face, stood up, and called James. They tried to get me to sign a forbearance, I said. They're desperate, James said. Mark knows the walls are closing in. He's going to try to stall the bank. We need to end this. The housewarming party is Saturday, I said. He's invited his boss. He's invited half the neighborhood. He thinks that if he plays the role of the successful homeowner publicly, it somehow makes it true. It's the perfect stage, James said. Do you have the affidavit? I do. I'll meet you there, James said. I'll bring the sheriff. No, I said. Not yet. I need to do this myself first. I need them to admit it when there's nowhere to hide. I need Mom and Dad to see who he really is. Elena, be careful. I'm done being careful, I said. I'm the one with the leverage now. Saturday approached like a storm front. I prepared my gift. It wasn't a toaster or a bottle of wine. It was a manila envelope containing the police report, the affidavit of forgery, the credit report showy, NG the attempted HELOC, and the printout of Mark's Florida indictment. I put on my best dress, a sharp black sheath that made me feel like an executioner. I checked my reflection. The tired, scared woman from Tuesday night was gone. In her place was someone cold, sharp, and ready to cut the poison out of her life. I drove to Oakwood Drive one last time. The driveway of 4200 Oakwood Drive was lined with cars. Not just family sedans, but luxury SUVs and sports cars, likely leased, likely for show, belonging to Mark's business associates, and the local real estate crowd he was so desperate to impress. The house was lit up like a beacon, every window glowing with warm, golden light that spilled out onto the manicured lawn. From the street, it looked like the American dream incarnate. From where I sat in my car, clutching the manila envelope, it looked like a crime scene. I watched a caterer carry a tray of champagne flutes through the front door. Mark wasn't just having a family dinner, he was hosting a gala. He was cementing his status. He was using my credit score to buy his reputation. I took a deep breath, the air in the car feeling stiflingly hot despite the cool evening. Showtime, I whispered to myself. I walked up the path, the gravel crunching loudly under my heels. The front door was open, spilling music and laughter into the night. I stepped into the foyer, and the sensory overload was immediate. The smell of expensive hors d'oeuvres, truffle oil, seared scallops mingled with the heavy scent of fresh lilies. There were easily 50 people inside. Chloe was holding court near the grand staircase. She wore a shimmering silver dress that caught the light, looking every inch the wealthy hostess. She was laughing at something a woman in a fur stole was saying, her head thrown back, a glass of champagne in her hand. When she saw me, her smile faltered. It didn't disappear, but it froze, turning brittle. She excused herself and rushed over, her heels clicking rapidly on the marble. "Elena, you came?" She hissed the words rather than spoke them, grabbing my elbow with a grip that was painful. "Please tell me you're not going to make a scene. Mark's boss, Mr. Henderson, is here. The regional VP is here. If you ruin this, you ruin everything." "I'm just here to give you your housewarming gift," I said, my voice calm, almost pleasant. I held up the thick envelope. Chloe eyed it suspiciously. "What is it?" "Just some paperwork, the final touches for the house." Before she could stop me, I pulled away and walked into the main living room. Mark was there, standing by the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a tumbler of scotch. He was mid-story, surrounded by a circle of men in suits who were nodding appreciatively. My parents stood on the periphery, looking proud but slightly out of place, clutching their drinks like lifeline anchors. "Mark," I called out. My voice wasn't loud, but it had a projection to it, a clarity honed by years of giving instructions across a busy pharmacy counter. It cut through the ambient chatter. Mark turned. His eyes widened when he saw me, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his face before he masked it with a wide, fake grin. "Elena, the sister-in-law of the year, wonderful of you to make it." He opened his arms as if to hug me. I didn't move. I stayed in the center of the room, creating a void around me as people sensed the shift in tension. The music seemed to dip. Conversations nearby trailed off. "I brought you something," I said, holding out the envelope. "For the house." "Oh, you shouldn't have," Mark said, laughing nervously. "We can open gifts later. Let's get you a drink." "I think you should open it now," I said. "It's relevant to the mortgage." The word mortgage hung in the air. In polite society, at a party like this, you don't talk about debt. You talk about architecture, or neighborhoods, or interest rates in the abstract. You don't talk about the loan itself. Mark's smile vanished. He stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Elena, don't do this." "Do what, Mark?" I asked, raising my voice slightly so the circle around him could hear. "I'm just clarifying the ownership, since I received the foreclosure notice on Tuesday." A gasp rippled through the small group. Mr. Henderson, a gray-haired man with a stern face, looked from Mark to me. "Foreclosure? Mark, what is she talking about? You said this was a cash-heavy deal." "It's a misunderstanding," Mark said quickly, sweat visibly breaking out on his upper lip. "My sister-in-law is confused. She's been under a lot of stress lately." "I'm not confused," I said. "I'm the borrower, according to the bank anyway." I opened the envelope. I didn't hand it to Mark. I handed the first document to my father. "Dad," I said, "read the top line. Who is the primary borrower on the deed to this house?" My father's hands shook as he took the paper. He squinted at it, his face paling. "Ale." "Na Vance," he whispered, "sole proprietor." "And the signature?" I asked. "It looks like yours," my mother said, peering over his shoulder. "But it's wobbly." "That's because it's a forgery," I said, turning back to Mark. "Just like the notary stamp from the shell company you used. Prestige Title Services. That's you, isn't it, Mark?" Mark lunged for the papers, but I stepped back. "I wouldn't," I warned. "That's a copy. The police have the original." The room went dead silent. The festive atmosphere evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of exposure. "You went to the cops," Chloe shrieked from the hallway, running into the room. "Elena, how could you?" "How could I?" I spun on her. "You stole my identity, Chloe. You took out an $850,000 loan in my name." "We were going to pay it back," Chloe screamed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. "We just needed a start. Why can't you just let us have this? You have everything. You have a career, you have savings. I have those things because I work for them, I shouted back, finally losing my cool. I didn't steal them from you. I turned to the crowd, to the neighbors, the bosses, the investors. But that's not even the worst part, I said, my voice shaking with rage. I pulled out the second document, the credit report. Tell them about the HELOC, Mark. Tell your boss how you applied for a $200,000 line of credit against my equity 3 days after closing. Mr. Henderson stepped forward. His face was like granite. Mark, is this true? Did you leverage a property you don't legally own? Mark opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a cornered animal. It was an investment strategy. We were going to flip the capital into your pocket, I finished. You bought this house for $600,000 from your own shell company, appraised it at $850, and pocketed the loan difference. And now you wanted another $200,000. You weren't building a home, Mark. You were stripping a carcass, and I was the carcass. My mother let out a low, keen sound and sank onto the sofa. My father looked at Mark with a mixture of horror and betrayal I had never seen before. I trusted you, my father whispered. I vouched for you. I did it for us, Mark yelled, his facade finally shattering into ugly, red-faced entitlement. I did it because nobody in this family has any ambition. You all sit around counting pennies while the world is there for the taking. I was making moves. You were committing wire fraud, a deep voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. James stood there, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers. Mark Specific, the officer said, stepping into the living room, his hand resting on his belt. We have a warrant for your arrest regarding identity theft, wire fraud, and forgery. Mark looked at the window as if contemplating a run for it, but he was surrounded. He was in the middle of his dream house, surrounded by his dream guests, and his nightmare had just walked through the front door. You BTCH, Mark spat at me as the officer grabbed his wrist and spun him around. You jealous, lonely BTCH. Maybe, I said, watching as the handcuffs clicked shut. But I'm a solvent B*TCH, and this is my house. Get out. The party didn't so much end as it dissolved into chaos. Guests fled like rats from a sinking ship, muttering apologies and clutching their purses, eager to distance themselves from the scandal. Mr. Henderson stayed just long enough to tell the police he would fully cooperate with the investigation and to fire Mark on the spot, loudly and with great prejudice. I stood in the center of the living room as the police escorted Mark out. Chloe was hysterical, clinging to his arm until the officers gently but firmly peeled her off. She collapsed onto the marble floor, the imported Italian marble she was so proud of, sobbing into the cold stone. My parents sat on the sofa, looking like statues. They were in shock. The illusion they had maintained for years, that Chloe was thriving, that Mark was a savior, that we were a happy, successful family, had been violently dismantled in under 10 minutes. James walked over to me. You okay? I think so, I said, my adrenaline fading, leaving me feeling hollowed out. Is it over? The criminal part is just starting, James said. But the financial part? We've stopped the bleeding. The affidavit is filed. The bank has already frozen the HELOC. They'll seize the house as evidence and then they'll foreclose. But since it's proven fraud, your credit will be scrubbed. It might take 6 months of paperwork, but you won't owe a dime. I nodded. I looked at the room one last time. The half-eaten appetizers, the abandoned wine glasses. It was a beautiful house. It was a shame it was built on quicksand. I walked over to Chloe. She didn't look up. Chloe, I said softly. Go away, she PT into the floor. You ruined my life. He's going to jail. I have nowhere to go. Mark ruined your life, I corrected her. He used you just like he used me. If I hadn't stopped him, he would have drained the equity, taken the cash, and left you with nothing but debt and a foreclosure. He was never going to pay for this house, Chloe. He was robbing us. She looked up then, her mascara smeared, her eyes wild. He loved me. He loved your access, I said. And if you want to be angry at me for saving you from bankruptcy, that's your choice. But I'm done paying for your mistakes. I looked at my parents. I'm going home. Do not call me to bail him out. Do not call me to ask for a lawyer. If you give him 1 cent of your retirement money, you are on your own. My father nodded slowly. He looked 10 years older. We won't, he whispered. I'm sorry, Alina, we didn't see it. You didn't want to see it, I said. I turned and walked out of the front door, past the police cruisers, past the gawking neighbors, and into the cool night air. The legal fallout was brutal. Mark was denied bail due to his previous record and the flight risk implied by his offshore shell companies. The dream house was seized by the bank within weeks. It turned out the appraisal was indeed fraudulent. The house had severe foundation issues that Mark had papered over. It was worth half of what he claimed. Chloe moved back in with our parents. She didn't speak to me for 3 months. When she finally did, it was a short text. He pleaded guilty. 5 years. I didn't reply. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt relief. I spent the next year rebuilding. I worked with James to meticulously scrub my credit report. I put extra shifts in at the pharmacy. I started going to therapy to unlearn the decades of conditioning that told me I existed to serve my family. 6 months after the party, I bought a house. It wasn't a mansion. It was a small 2-bedroom cottage with a garden and a porch that needed painting. It was in a quiet neighborhood. The mortgage was modest. The down payment came from my savings, every cent earned, taxed, and accounted for. On the day I got the keys, I sat on the floor of the empty living room. It smelled of dust and potential. It was small, it was humble. But when I signed the deed, my hand didn't shake. The signature was mine, the debt was mine, and the peace, that was mine too. I poured myself a glass of cheap wine and toasted the empty room. To solvency, I said aloud. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly, completely home.